At first, many people dismissed the torpedo fish's shock as occult. Some said it was probably just the fish biting. Others that it couldn't be a shock because without a spark, it just wasn't electricity. But for most, this was a very strange and inexplicable new mystery. And it would take one of the oddest yet most brilliant characters in British science to begin to unlock the secrets of the torpedo fish. This is the only picture in existence of the pathologically shy but exceptional Henry Cavendish. This one only exists because an artist sketched his coat as it hung on a peg, then filled in the face from memory. His family were fantastically rich. They were the Devonshires, who still own Chatsworth House in Derbyshire. But Henry Cavendish decided to turn his back on his family's wealth and status, to live in London near his beloved Royal Society, where he could quietly pursue his passion for experimental science. When he heard about the electric torpedo fish, he was intrigued. A friend wrote to him, "On this, my first experience of the effect of the torpedo, I exclaimed that this is certainly electricity. But how?" And to work out how a living thing could produce electricity, he decided to make his own artificial fish. These are his plans. 2 Leyden jars shaped like the fish, which were buried under sand. When the sand was touched, they discharged, giving a nasty shock. His model helped convince him that the real torpedo fish was electric. But it still left him with a nagging problem. Although both the real fish and Cavendish's artificial one gave powerful electric shocks, the real fish never sparked. Cavendish was perplexed. How could it be the same kind of electricity if they didn't both do the same kinds of things? Cavendish spent the winter of 1773 in his laboratory trying to come up with an answer. And in the spring, he had a brainwave. Cavendish's ingenious answer was to point out a subtle distinction between the amount of electricity and its intensity. The real fish produced the same kind of electricity, it's just that it was less intense. Now, for a physicist like me, this marks a crucial turning point because it's the moment when 2 genuinely innovative scientific ideas first crop up. What Cavendish refers to as the amount of electricity, we now call electric charge. And his intensity is what we call the potential difference or voltage. So the Leyden jar's shock was high voltage but low charge, whereas the fish was low voltage and high charge. And it's possible to actually measure that. Hiding at the bottom of this tank under the sand is the torpedo marmorata, and it's an electric ray. You can just see its eyes protruding from the sand. This is a fully grown female, and I'm going to try and measure the electricity it gives off with this bait. I've got this fish connected to a metal rod and hooked up to an oscilloscope to see if I can measure the voltage as it catches its prey. So here goes. Oh, there's one. And there's another one. The fish gave a shock of about 240 volts, the same as mains electricity, but still roughly 10 times less than the Leyden jar. Well, that would have given me quite a nasty shock. And I can only try and imagine what it must have been like for scientists in the 18th century to witness this. An animal, a fish, producing its own electricity. Cavendish had shown that the torpedo fish made electricity, but he didn't know if it was the same kind of electricity as that made from an electrical machine.
Is the electrical shock that a torpedo produces, is it the same as produced by an electrical machine? Or are there two kinds? Is there a kind that's generated artificially, or is there a kind of animal electricity that only exists in living bodies? And this was a huge debate that divided opinion for several decades.
And out of that bitter debate came a new discovery. The discovery that electricity needn't be a brief shock or spark, but could actually be continuous. And the generation of continuous electricity would ultimately propel us into our modern age. But the next step in the story of electricity would come about because of a fierce personal and professional rivalry between two Italian academics.
This is Bologna University, one of the oldest in Europe. In the late 18th century, the city of Bologna was ruled from papal Rome, which meant that the university was powerful but conservative in its thinking.
It was steeped in traditional Christianity, one where God ruled earth from heaven, but that the way he ran the world was hidden from us mere mortals. We were not meant to understand him, only to serve him. And one of the university's brightest stars was the anatomist Luigi Alisio Galvani. But in a neighbouring city, a rival electrician was about to take Galvani to task.
This is Pavia, only 150 miles from Bologna, but by the end of the 18th century, worlds apart politically. It was part of the Austrian Empire, which put it at the very heart of the European Enlightenment, liberal in its thinking, politically radical, and obsessed with the new science of electricity. It was also home to Alessandro Volta. Alessandro Volta couldn't have been more unlike Galvani. From an old Lombardy family, he was young, arrogant, charismatic, a real ladies' man, and he courted controversy. Unlike Galvani, he liked to show off his experiments on an international stage to any audience.
Volta's ideas were unfettered by Galvani's religious dogma. Like Benjamin Franklin and the European Enlightenment, he believed in rationality, that scientific truth, like a Greek god, would cast ignorance to the floor. Superstition was the enemy, reason was the future. Both men were fascinated by electricity, and both brought their different ways of seeing the world to bear on it.
Galvani had been attracted to the use of electricity in medical treatments. For instance, in 1759, here in Bologna, electricity was used on the muscles of a paralyzed man. One report said it was a fine sight to see the mastoid rotate the head, the biceps bend the elbow. In short, to see the force and vitality of all the motions occurring in every paralyzed muscle subjected to the stimulus. Galvani believed these kinds of examples revealed that the body worked using animal electricity, a fluid that flows from the brain through the nerves into the muscles where it's turned into motion. And he devised a series of grisly experiments to prove it.
Now, he first prepared a frog. He writes, "The frog is skinned and disemboweled, only their lower limbs are left joined together, containing just the crural nerves." Well, I've left my frog mostly intact, but I've exposed the nerves that connect to the frog's legs. Then he used Hawksby's electrical machine to generate electrostatic charge that would accumulate and travel along this arm and out through this copper wire. Then he connected the charge-carrying wire to the frog and another to the nerve just above the leg. Let's see what happens. Oh, and the frog's leg twitches just as he makes contact. There we go.
Now, for Galvani, what was going on there was that there's a strange, special kind of entity in the animal muscle, which he calls animal electricity. It's not like any other electricity. It's intrinsic to living beings.
But for Volta, animal electricity smacked of superstition and magic. It had no place in rational and enlightened science.
Volta saw the experiment completely differently to Galvani. He believed it revealed something totally new. For him, the legs weren't jumping as a result of the release of animal electricity from within them, but because of the artificial electricity from outside. The legs were merely the indicator.
They were only twitching because of the electricity from the Hawksby machine. Back in Bologna, Galvani reacted furiously to Volta's ideas. He believed Volta had crossed a fundamental line from electrical experiment into God's realm, and that was tantamount to heresy.
To have a kind of spirit like electricity, to have that produced artificially, and to say that that spirit, that living force, that agency was the same as something produced by God, that God had put into a living human body or a frog's body, that seemed sacrilegious to them because it was eliminating this boundary between God's realm of the divine and the mundane realm of the material.
Spurred on by his religious indignation, Galvani announced a new series of experimental results which would prove that Volta was wrong. During one of his experiments, he hung his frogs on an iron wire and saw something totally unexpected.
If he connected a copper wire to the wire the frog was hanging from, and then touched the other end of the copper to the nerve, it seemed to him that he could make the frog's leg twitch without any electricity at all.
Galvani came to the conclusion that it must have been something inside the frogs, even if dead, that continued for a while after death to produce some kind of electricity.
And the metal wires were somehow releasing that electricity. Over the next months, Galvani's experiments focused on isolating this animal electricity using combinations of frog and metal, Leyden jars and electrical machines.
For Galvani, these experiments were proof that the electricity was originating within the frog itself. The frog's muscles were Leyden jars, storing up the electrical fluid and then releasing it in a burst. On the 30th of October 1786, he published his findings in a book, De Animali Electricitati, of animal electricity.